Hey everybody, it's the Board Game Blogger. Today we're going to look at Triumph and Tragedy. Now, this is an excellent three-player game that set sort of in Europe, World War II, runs 1936 to 1945. You can actually go the whole game without even going to war, though. It's usually not a good idea because there's always kind of someone has an advantage to go to war at any given point. You know, it's clear somebody's going to win a peace victory, and the only alternative is to kind of go to war in the game. But this is an excellent game. It plays quite quickly. Once everyone knows how to play, you can do this like 3.5 hours. The first game, it's going to be a learning process. I actually learned the game at BGCon. It was taught to me by the developer, Brian Evans. Wonderful, great guy. I'd actually had planned to play a game with a couple other guys. I'd scheduled it on one of the geek lists, and I think they just had too much to drink the night before, and they didn't show up for the meeting. And Brian was just a great guy, and he just knew I was really interested in wanting to play the game. And we organized a game like later that day and learned it, and it was excellent. Components are pretty good for the most part. There's a rule book. It's well written. Again, I didn't learn the game through reading the rule book. It was taught to me, so I can't give 100%. This is a great way to learn the game or not. But there is an index, which I always like. I really want indexes in the game. That's really helpful. There's also a playbook. I always find that's really helpful. If you are learning it, to just kind of see, okay, this is what happens. Here's some sample turns. That's excellent. Every game needs an index. Every game needs a playbook. There's a very good player aid, and there's one for each power. So there are 3 of these player aids. Here's the Soviet one. So here's the Axis one, and you've got the units and the different things they can do. And then, basic rules, turn sequence, technology, how combat phase works. It's excellent game. It's a block style war game. I really like block games, just the extra kind of hidden fog of war. I'd say the one component I'm not a fan of is the map. It's not a mounted map. They are making one, though, in the second edition, is my understanding. Just because it's been quite popular. You've got cards. It's kind of a card-driven game, but not in the traditional card-driven game sense. But cards are used to activate movements and can be used for other things. You've got your different blocks. They can only be upgraded a pip a turn. And what's really neat is there's a lot of kind of economics in the game. That's kind of the heart of the game. There's 3 key resources. There is population, there are resources, and there's industry. And your production is always the lowest of the 3. Now, while you're at peace, and haven't started World War II yet, you've basically got unlimited natural resources because you can trade for all the hard to find stuff. But then once you go into war, that can be a very big bottleneck. But also your industry, if you just haven't built a lot of industry, that can be an issue. And then your population, just basically how much population you can put to work. And so each kind of power has their own kind of what they're starting off at initially. But then you can bring in, gain minor alliances. The diplomacy for getting the minor powers into the game is really neat in this game. It's an excellent. I think it's probably the best strategic World War II game out there. And what I like is, you're done in 3.5 hours if everyone knows what they're doing. If everyone doesn't know what they're doing and you're learning, it can take 6 or so. I guess. If people have AP, that could be an issue. But why don't we take a look at the board and just kind of how play goes. Let's do that now. So here's the board. I haven't really set anything up. So each game, you're going to have sort of a totally different setup. So here you have a setup here for the Soviets. And they can build different types of units. So in Moscow, you're going to get basically 3 CVs, 3 pips, so 3 blocks with 1 pip each of whatever you want. Same in Leningrad as 2, and so on. And then the Soviets also get 1 3-strength pip block of an infantry in Moscow. But what that means is each game you're going to have a different setup. You know, it's kind of what your strategy is going for. So one time, I played this game. I played it probably 10 or 11 times now, so I really enjoy it. I really think it's balanced. I think one of the issues with a lot of 3-player games is, you know, you're just beating up. The 2 weaker players are going to beat up on whoever is the strongest player. And that doesn't really make for a fun game. But this game, they've been able to kind of balance things out. They've given Germany, you know, kind of an early advantage. So they have what are these diplomacy decks. And this is the meat of like how the game's activated. So in basically the government phase, you know, once you've spent production, you know, to purchase these cards, you can like spend it here to put influence into Turkey, or I could play it as influence in Persia, or I could play it during the year as a fall command card to activate 6 units and move them. And the activation priority is letter P. So anything in the alphabet before P, that's going to happen first. Anything after is going to go subsequent. And that's really important. This kind of timing is really key on some of these. But let's say I played it here in Turkey. You know, what we can see here is they have 1 resource, and then they've got Istanbul and Ankara as kind of bigger cities. Izmir just counts as a town, so that's not going to add any population. But by placing this in, they're now going to be trading with me. So for instance, if this was the Soviets, we'd say, okay, they're now trading with the Soviets, and they're going to get 2 more population and a resource. And as I mentioned earlier, that's kind of what your production is the lowest of 3. So getting alliances can be important. And then if they had actually allied with the country, then that can no longer be affected through diplomacy cards. It's now allied to the Soviets. And the Soviets will actually get military units in there. They've kind of mustered the Turkish army. So they're going to get a 3 pip block for the capital, 2 pip block for Izmir, and even just a 1 pip block for Izmir, rather 2 for Istanbul. So it's a neat diplomacy system as you're playing these cards trying to affect others. And as I was mentioning, Germany is actually going to start with, you know, 14 of these diplomacy cards to kind of start off the bat. And even though Germany is in the middle and is basically very likely going to be attacked by both sides, but again, I've played 10, 11 games of this, and you're going to have some games that don't turn out that way. So it's a very replayable game. The victory conditions, you know, they happen in a couple of ways. So here we can see this is kind of a sub-capital in the Ruhr, and then Berlin's a major capital. Each side has 3 capitals, your major and your 2 subs. The other one here is the Italian Rome. USSR, for instance, has Baku, as well as Moscow and Leningrad. So if one side captures 2 enemy either major or sub-capitals, they win. And it could be a combination. So as the Germans, if you take Paris and Leningrad, for instance, that's a victory. Another victory is to, at the beginning of the year, if you announce you've got 25 victory points, you win. And then so victory points is here along your victory point track. It's going to be the lowest of your production. Here we can see what the defaults. So Germany starts with only 6 resources. But again, they're going to be at peace initially, so they have infinite resources. They're going to have 11 population and 12 industry. And this can move up and will across the track. So let's say the lowest at some turn is at 20. You can also have these peace dividends. So peace dividends come out every year that you are at peace or haven't declared war. You're going to get a peace dividend. Now the victory points range from 0 to 2, and they're hidden, so it can really be an issue. that kind of generates aggression. So if I've drawn, it's 4 years have gone by, and I've just drawn all zeros, maybe some of my opponents have some more peace dividends, and that's kind of just, their economy is humming along, and then I may need to attack because of that if I don't think I'm going to get a victory in another sense. So that's a way. If the game goes all the way to 1945 here, and no one has won, then whoever has the most victory points wins. And then another victory is if you develop basically nuclear bombs and have the ability to deploy them to an enemy capital. So you've got, basically an air force within range. Then you can win that way. So there's 4 levels of tech in the nukes to build. I haven't played a game where that's happened yet. Again, I played it 10, 11 times. Maybe it's just kind of my game group, because basically, other than playing it one time at BGG Con, I've played with about maybe the same 5 or 6 people. Again, it's only a 3-player game, but we kind of rotate who we're playing with. So, maybe that has to do with kind of groupthink, or, I'm not sure. I just don't know how common the nuclear victory is. Obviously, it was ahistorical in Europe, so maybe it's intended to be difficult, but I can definitely see a path towards doing that, and I can see some games could have come out that way if the cards had come that way. Because the way you develop tech is you choose to spend a production in your basically investment deck, and you get, it can be used as factory production. So for instance, the Axis, their factories cost 5 unless somebody declares war on them, and then they go down to 4, and if another power declares war, they're down to 3. If you declare war, though, you don't get the industry reduction bonus. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Additionally, declaring war on somebody, you lose 1 victory point. And that can be crucial. I mean, it really can be. Just 1 victory point can kind of matter. Not in like the Eurogame sense where it's 100 points and somebody else is 98, but it's just it can be close in a tight game here. Again, 25 victory points is all you need to win. So you can spend production. So as you saw, let's say it was the start of the game, I need 5. If I spend 2 of these cards that I've purchased, 3 and 3, I can build it, I don't get any change. Now the way you develop tech, for instance, is if you have 2, so let's say I want to develop naval radar, which gives me fleets have first fire. I have to spend 2, 1 I discard, and then 1 I put out in front of me, showing I now have this tech. There's an interesting aspect to the game also, is I could choose to secretly develop it. So I say, okay, I've developed a tech, I'm going to vault it, I'm going to discard this, and so I don't have this tech out. So I'm not sure, my opponents don't know exactly what I've developed. And then I can choose to reveal it at any given time. The problem is that's decreasing my hand limit. As you can see here, Germany has a 7-card hand limit. So I'm going to be less active with some options if I choose to go that route. So again, there's these 2 types of cards. There's the kind of the diplomacy action cards, and then the investment cards. And so when you're spending your production at the beginning of every year, you can choose to basically build more military units or purchase from either of the decks. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. One thing that's really neat in the military units is, if we zoom in here, let's say this is, we want Germany to invade Czechoslovakia. So let's say I've got some blocks here. And so we got a 4-pipper, a 2-pipper, and a 3-pip. And I want to invade Czechoslovakia. I can declare war on this neutral Czechoslovakia. It's going to give my opponents 2 diplomacy cards each, just kind of due to the international outrage. Now, what happens is I can't just send all these units across the border because there's a forest border. And if we check the border limits here, you can only send 2 blocks across that border. So I'd have to actually swing it around. So I can move this guy, and they'd cross a different border, and I'd invade Czechoslovakia. Even though it's a neutral country, they would then get a fort to, defend themselves. So we'd get a fort here, and it's based on the population. So population here, it's a city, so it's muster value of 2. They'd have a 2 strength fort. And then a battle would ensue. And this is kind of priority of rolling dice. So fortresses are always going to roll first. And normally the defender will always roll first unless it's modified by tech, or if you declare war on a major power, that's going to give them kind of a surprise attack that very first season. But let's say, you know, I played a card, I played this card as the axis. I say I'm declaring war on Czechoslovakia, it's fall, I can move 6 units. I moved those units, now we're having the battle. So we look here, fortresses, they have ground 4. So they hit on a 4 or less on the dice. So we're going to zoom out here, we'll have our battle happen. Okay, I got a 4 and a 3. So now the German player will take 2 hits. Now they have to take it on the strongest units first. So I've got 2 4 blocks and a 2 pip. So that's going to go down 1. Now this has to take the next hit because it's now the strongest. And now the German player is going to roll, and they have 8 dice. Now they're all infantry. So infantry on ground, they hit on 3 or less, and the fortress is a ground unit. So they just need to get 2 hits here. So that was 1 hit on 8 dice, and we'll roll another 4 and another hit. So that was 2 hits, so that defeated the fortress, and now the Germans control it, and they're going to gain access to that population. So they would then put a control marker down, and their population would move up, and there's markers here that control that, and you'd go up here to just show that their population's increased, and you know, their production capacity goes up. So that's kind of how combat works. It's kind of a very simple one. But it's a really great game. There's a lot of tension. There's like, I don't know if I should attack. I don't know what the strength is. Because when your opponent is building something, they don't announce like, I'm building an infantry. They just say, I'm building, you know, a 1 strength block here. Or I'm upgrading a couple of blocks. So you can only build blocks in your home country. So for instance, Germany, just in natural Germany. So let's say now, a couple of turns have gone by, Germany controls Czechoslovakia. They can't build new blocks in Czechoslovakia, but they could choose to upgrade it, so they could spend a production to reinforce that strength, and that's a legitimate move. So, you know, once Germany's trying to push into the Soviet Union, you know, and their supply lines are extended, you know, that's a good way to represent it. Additionally, as you saw, there was different cards here. You know, there's summer cards, fall cards, spring cards. The Soviets can have a special season, a winter season, where they can play any card they want to move only within the Soviet Union. So it's a neat way of just kind of representing the power of winter that was so helpful for the Soviets. If we zoom in here, we can see, for instance, there's different kind of resources here. This is a resource and then a trans-African resource. So what could happen is, you know, the Axis players could choose to try and blockade. If they got a fleet in here that can blockade resources that are being sent to Britain here, and that can be very powerful. It can really hamper the West in having the resources blocked. But as you notice, there were some trans-African ones, so they can always be sent around the Cape of Good Hope and not blockaded even if the Mediterranean is, whereas there are still some resources that have to be shipped through the Mediterranean. So the blockades add a really interesting aspect to the game. Of course, the Axis could still, you know, blockade it if they, you know, get a fleet here into the Atlantic Ocean. You could still blockade Britain and the trans-African resources that way. So it's an interesting game. There's a lot. You're going to see the Soviet Union and the West go to war occasionally too. You know, didn't happen historically, but very well could have happened. And this game produces some incentives for making that happen. So it's a really great game. I like how the diplomacy works. I find it's really balanced. And that's a very difficult thing to do in a 3-player game, because normally there's just that inclination to beat up on, you know, the 2 people behind beat up on the player in the lead, and then it's the the second ranking player wins, is what happens in a lot of games. And there's different ways to try and go around that. So Churchill, for instance, is trying to avoid that, but then they've got some kind of convoluted scoring rules. And you don't have any convoluted scoring rules here, but what you have is just, it's built into the game, that balance. So I really like it. This has really surpassed Churchill for me. Again, since BGG Con in, when was that, October, November? I've played it 10, 11 times. And I usually just, it's just playing once a week. So it's like, that's the weekly game. This is hitting the table a lot. It's enjoyed by a lot of different people here. It's, in my normal game group, 5, 6 people. And when we have just 3 players, this is really our go-to game. Now, we don't always have just 3 players, but if we do, this is getting played. It's really pushed Churchill aside as a 3-player war game. Churchill's still a great game. It's just, I would say, it's not quite as good, and it's different. And a lot of people want this. They want the war rolling. So, I mean, I don't want to knock Churchill. It's a different game. But even trying to judge different games, I'd say this one is the better game. It's too bad this one doesn't have the mounted map. It's coming out soon. It's an excellent, excellent game. If you play 3-player at all, get this game. It's going to be like your #1 3-player game. Just the aspect of how diplomacy works with the neutral powers is excellent. Production, just to spur those advances into opponents' territories, just really interesting. I haven't gone into all the specific rules. There's, the tech development can really make things interesting. And then you can be doing strategic bombing once you've developed precision bomb sites. It's excellent. One last thing here is America does not actually start the game in the war. And so the West is really trying to get them involved, and if Paul Renault can get them in before France falls, that's going to be really helpful. Because the West player just simply plays France and Britain. And if your minor power's capital falls, so either Paris or Rome, that country's just out of the war. And so taking the capital can be very, very powerful. There's a big incentive to do that. But yeah, excellent, excellent game. I highly recommend it. Till next time, I'm the Board Game Blogger.